The aluminum hull of Flight 847 vibrated with the familiar hum of twin Pratt and Whitney engines at 37,000 feet, somewhere over the restless Pacific. In row 9, seat C, a woman with calloused hands and tired eyes stared through the oval window at clouds that looked like scattered cotton against an endless blue canvas. Her boarding pass read Kestra Voss, but the name felt foreign now, like borrowed clothes that no longer fit. The other passengers saw nothing remarkable about her, just another traveler in jeans and a faded hoodie, returning from wherever life had taken her. They couldn't see the invisible weight she carried, the way her fingers unconsciously traced patterns on her thigh where flight controls used to be, or how her eyes tracked the wing's subtle movements with the precision of someone who had once commanded aircraft worth more than most people's houses. What they also couldn't see was the storm brewing in the cockpit 200 feet ahead, where Captain Marcus Reeves was discovering that his 15 years of commercial aviation had not prepared him for what was about to unfold. The first sign of trouble came as a barely perceptible shudder through the airframe, followed by an amber warning light that shouldn't have been there. His co-pilot, First Officer Diana Zhang, glanced at the instrument panel with the kind of controlled concern that comes from hours of simulator training. But this wasn't a simulation. "Tower, this is Pacific Air 847 Heavy," Reeves transmitted, his voice steady despite the growing collection of warning indicators painting his cockpit in urgent yellows and reds. "We're showing multiple hydraulic anomalies and requesting priority vectors to nearest suitable airport." The response crackled back through their headsets. "Pacific 847, nearest suitable is still 800 nautical miles. Can you maintain altitude and heading?" That's when the real nightmare began. The primary hydraulic system failed completely, followed 30 seconds later by the backup. The massive Boeing 777 suddenly felt like a wounded bird, its control surfaces responding with the sluggishness of something that wanted to fall from the sky. In the passenger cabin, people began to notice the subtle changes, the way their coffee tilted differently in their cups, how the aircraft's gentle corrections felt more pronounced, more deliberate. But in row 9, Kestra Voss wasn't looking at her coffee. She was reading the aircraft's behavior like a familiar language, her body instinctively cataloging the symptoms of catastrophic system failure. Her pulse quickened, not with fear, but with the muscle memory of someone who had faced worse odds in unfriendlier skis. She closed her eyes and tried to forget, tried to remain just another passenger, but the aircraft was speaking to her in a dialect she couldn't ignore. Somewhere in the cockpit ahead, two pilots were about to face a crisis that would test every hour of their training. What they didn't know was that their salvation sat quietly in coach, trying very hard to remain invisible. The Pacific stretched endlessly below, indifferent to the drama unfolding 7 miles above its surface. Captain Reeves felt sweat gathering beneath his uniform collar as he realized that his aircraft was becoming increasingly difficult to control. Each input to the flight controls required more force, more finesse, and the Boeing's responses were becoming more unpredictable with each passing minute. This wasn't the kind of emergency they practiced in recurrent training. This was the nightmare scenario that instructors mentioned in hushed tones, the one where all the backup systems fail and pilots earn their pay. "Control surfaces are sluggish across the board," First Officer Zhang reported, her hands moving across the checklist with practiced efficiency. "I'm reading significant pressure loss in all 3 hydraulic circuits." Her voice carried the clinical detachment of professional training, but Reeves could hear the underlying tension. They both knew what complete hydraulic failure meant in a wide-body aircraft. Very few pilots had ever successfully landed a plane in this condition, and fewer still had walked away to tell the story. The aircraft shuddered again, more violently this time, and several passengers looked up from their books and electronic devices with the kind of casual concern that comes before real fear sets in. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced smiles, but their trained eyes were cataloging every detail, ready to transition from service mode to emergency protocols at a moment's notice. In row 9, Kestra felt the shudder differently. It wasn't just turbulence or a rough patch of air. It was the sound of metal under stress, of systems failing in cascade. Her right hand involuntarily moved toward where a stick would be in a fighter aircraft, her left searching for throttles that weren't there. These weren't conscious movements but the reflexes of someone who had spent thousands of hours reading the sky through the seat of her pants. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Reeves's voice came through the cabin speakers with forced calm. "We're experiencing some minor technical difficulties and will be making an unscheduled landing as a precautionary measure. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing." Minor technical difficulties. Kestra almost smiled at the euphemism. She could feel what the aircraft was really telling them, could sense the growing desperation in its mechanical responses. This Boeing 777 was dying slowly, system by system, and everyone aboard was about to become part of a story that would either end in miraculous salvation or tragic loss. The difference between those outcomes might well depend on whether two commercial pilots could accomplish something that few aviators in history had ever managed. The flight attendants began their emergency preparations with the kind of choreographed efficiency that comes from countless drills, but Kestra could see the subtle signs of genuine concern in their movements. This wasn't a drill or a precautionary landing. This was rapidly becoming a fight for survival at 37,000 feet. Captain Reeves gripped the yoke with both hands, feeling the aircraft's responses growing more sluggish with each passing moment. The Boeing 777 was built with triple redundancy in its critical systems, but they were experiencing the kind of cascading failure that aeronautical engineers designed against but couldn't entirely prevent. His years of experience flying domestic routes suddenly felt inadequate against the magnitude of what they were facing. "I need you to pull up everything we have on manual reversion flying," he told Zhang, referring to the nearly impossible task of controlling a modern airliner without hydraulic assistance. "And get me every airport within 200 miles with a runway long enough for a heavy approach." Zhang's fingers flew across the flight management system, but they both knew the mathematics were grim. A Boeing 777 without hydraulic controls was like trying to steer a freight train with a bicycle's handlebars. The control forces required would be enormous, the precision nearly impossible to maintain, and the landing speeds far higher than any runway was designed to accommodate safely. The aircraft lurched slightly to the left, and Reeves had to apply significant pressure to level the wings. Each control input was becoming a negotiation rather than a command, and he could feel the machine's growing reluctance to obey. Sweat was now visible on his forehead despite the cockpit's climate control, and his uniform shirt was beginning to stick to his back. In the cabin, passengers were starting to notice that this wasn't a routine announcement. The flight attendants' smiles had become more strained, their movements more purposeful. A few people began reaching for their phones, trying to send last-minute messages before the cellular signals faded beyond reach. Others stared out windows, watching the ocean far below and perhaps contemplating the significance of all that empty water. Kestra closed her eyes and tried to block out the aircraft's increasingly urgent mechanical pleas for help. She had spent years trying to forget the feeling of an aircraft in distress, the weight of responsibility that came with being the only thing standing between hundreds of lives and catastrophe. She was nobody now, just a passenger in seat 9C, and that's how she wanted it to remain. But the Boeing 777 wasn't cooperating with her desire for anonymity. It was screaming for someone who understood its language, someone who could translate its mechanical distress into human action. The cockpit voice recorder would later capture the moment when First Officer Zhang's voice cracked slightly as she read the emergency checklist. "Manual reversion checklist complete, Captain. We're on our own from here." "Pacific 847, this is air traffic control. We're showing your aircraft deviating from assigned heading. Please confirm your status." Captain Reeves keyed his microphone, and for the first time, his professional composure showed hairline cracks. "Control, Pacific 847 is experiencing complete hydraulic failure. We're attempting manual reversion, but control authority is extremely limited. We need immediate vectors to the nearest suitable runway and emergency services standing by." The silence that followed lasted only seconds but felt like hours. Then, "Pacific 847, understand complete hydraulic failure. Nearest suitable airport is still 600 nautical miles at your current heading. Emergency services are being notified. Can you maintain controlled flight?" Reeves looked at his instruments, watched the aircraft's nose drift slowly despite his constant pressure on the controls, and felt the honest answer stick in his throat. The truth was that he wasn't sure how much longer they could maintain anything resembling controlled flight. Each minute brought new challenges as the aircraft's behavior became more unpredictable. "We'll do our best, Control," he finally answered, and those 4 words carried the weight of 347 souls aboard Flight 847. The ocean below continued its ancient rhythm, waves catching sunlight in patterns that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But at 37,000 feet, beauty was the last thing on anyone's mind. In the cockpit, 2 pilots faced the flight of their lives. In the cabin, passengers began to understand that their routine journey had become something far more significant. And in row 9, a woman with calloused hands and tired eyes felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like an old, unwelcome coat. The Boeing 777's flight manual contained procedures for many emergency scenarios, but complete hydraulic failure was listed under extremely improbable events, the kind of situation that occurred perhaps once in aviation history, if at all. Captain Reeves and First Officer Zhang were now writing new chapters in that manual with every decision they made. Zhang wiped sweat from her forehead as she worked through contingency after contingency. "Captain, I've calculated our current descent rate and fuel consumption. At this rate of control degradation, we might not reach any runway with sufficient control authority to attempt a landing." The words hung in the cockpit air like a death sentence. Reeves felt the aircraft drift again and applied more pressure to the controls, his arms already beginning to ache from the constant battle against the machine's increasing reluctance to obey. Modern airliners weren't designed to be flown manually at altitude. They were technological marvels that relied on hydraulic assistance to translate human inputs into the massive forces required to move control surfaces at high speed. "Keep working the problem," Reeves said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "There has to be something we're missing." But they both knew the mathematics of their situation. Without hydraulics, the Boeing 777 was becoming an increasingly uncontrollable glider, one that weighed over 400,000 pounds and was currently moving at 540 miles per hour through thin air that provided little authority over its massive control surfaces. The passenger cabin had grown quieter as people began to sense the gravity of their situation. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced calm, but experienced travelers could read the subtle signs. The way the cabin crew's eyes lingered on emergency equipment, how their smiles had become performance rather than genuine warmth. In row 9, Kestra Voss opened her eyes and stared at the seatback in front of her. She could feel every nuance of the aircraft's struggle, could almost hear the pilot's growing desperation even through the thick insulation of the passenger cabin. Her hands clenched involuntarily as muscle memory triggered responses to an emergency that wasn't officially hers to solve. She had sworn she was done with this life, done with the weight of other people's survival resting on her decisions. But the Boeing 777 didn't care about her personal vows or her desire for anonymity. It was dying, and somewhere in her bones, She knew she might be the only person aboard who truly understood how to save it. The next few minutes would determine whether Flight 847 became another tragic headline or a miracle of aviation. In the cockpit, two commercial pilots fought against impossible odds. In the cabin, passengers began to pray to whatever gods they favored. And in row 9, a reluctant hero tried desperately to remain invisible while the sky itself seemed to be calling her name. Captain Reeves felt the first bead of sweat drop from his chin onto the flight controls as the aircraft's nose pitched down despite his increasingly desperate efforts to maintain level flight. The Boeing 777 was teaching him a harsh lesson about the difference between flying an airplane and wrestling with 400,000 pounds of barely controlled metal. His arms burned from the constant pressure required to keep the aircraft even marginally stable, and he could see in his peripheral vision that First Officer Zhang was having similar struggles with her own controls. "I'm losing elevator authority," Zhang reported, her voice tight with concentration and growing alarm. "Nose-down moment is increasing beyond what I can compensate for." The words every pilot dreads were becoming reality. The aircraft was telling them it no longer wanted to fly. Without hydraulic assistance, the massive elevators and rudder were becoming increasingly difficult to move, and the aerodynamic forces at their current altitude and speed were working against every human input. "Pacific 847, this is control. We're reading your altitude as decreasing. Can you maintain flight level?" Reeves keyed his microphone with one hand while fighting the controls with the other. "Negative, control. We're in an uncommanded descent and losing control authority by the minute. We need options, and we need them now." The silence from air traffic control spoke volumes. There were no good options when a wide-body airliner lost all hydraulic control at cruise altitude over open ocean. The nearest runway was still hundreds of miles away, and both pilots were beginning to understand that they might not have enough control authority remaining to reach any runway, let alone land safely on one. In the passenger cabin, the flight attendants began their emergency briefings with the kind of professional calm that belied the severity of their situation. Passengers listened with varying degrees of attention, some still convinced this was routine precautionary procedure, others beginning to understand that they were participants in an unfolding aviation emergency. Kestra heard the lead flight attendant's voice over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, as a precautionary measure, we're going to review emergency procedures. Please locate the safety card in your seat pocket and follow along as we demonstrate." Precautionary measure. The euphemisms continued, but Kestra could feel the aircraft's increasingly erratic behavior through the cabin floor. Each slight deviation from level flight, each momentary roll or pitch, told the story of pilots fighting a losing battle against physics and mechanical failure. She closed her eyes and tried to calculate the aircraft's options based on what she could feel through her seat. The descent rate was increasing, which meant the pilots were losing elevator authority faster than they could compensate. The occasional rolling motion suggested aileron effectiveness was also degrading. In her mind, she ran through emergency procedures she hadn't thought about in years, calculating fuel loads and glide ratios and control authority margins. The mathematics were grim. At their current rate of control degradation, Captain Reeves and First Officer Zhang had perhaps 20 minutes before the Boeing 777 became completely uncontrollable. 20 minutes to cover hundreds of miles to the nearest runway, assuming they could even maintain enough control authority to attempt a landing approach. Kestra's hands moved unconsciously, her right hand positioning itself where a control stick would be, her left searching for throttles and trim controls that existed only in her muscle memory. She was responding to an emergency that wasn't officially her responsibility, but every fiber of her being understood what was happening in the cockpit ahead. She had once been among the best at solving impossible problems in hostile skis, but that was before everything went wrong, before she lost everything that mattered, before she decided that the world of military aviation could continue without her particular skills. Now she was just another passenger, anonymous and forgotten, exactly as she had planned. But the Boeing 777 was calling to her in a language only a few people in the world truly understood, and its voice was becoming increasingly desperate with each passing moment. The cockpit was becoming a battlefield where Captain Reeves and First Officer Zhang fought against forces that grew stronger with every second. The control yoke required so much pressure now that both pilots were using both hands, their arms trembling with effort as they tried to maintain even basic aircraft control. Sweat stained their uniforms despite the air conditioning, and their breathing had become labored from the physical exertion of wrestling with an increasingly uncooperative machine. "I can't hold this much longer," Zhang admitted, her voice strained with effort. "My arms are cramping and the forces are increasing faster than I can adapt." Reeves knew exactly what she meant. His own arms felt like they were on fire, and he could feel his grip beginning to slip on controls that seemed determined to wrench themselves from his hands. The Boeing 777 was designed to be flown with light touch and hydraulic assistance. Without those systems, it was like trying to steer a freight train with nothing but human muscle power. "Pacific 847, we've located a military airfield approximately 400 miles northeast of your position. Runway is 13,000 feet, but you'll need to navigate terrain and weather systems to reach it." 400 miles. Reeves looked at his instruments and tried to calculate whether they could maintain any semblance of controlled flight for that distance. At their current rate of control degradation, it seemed unlikely they would have enough authority remaining to attempt even the most basic landing approach. "Roger, Control. Send us vectors to that field and alert them we're coming in with no hydraulics and minimal control authority." The response came quickly. "Understood, 847. Vector heading 045 degrees. Military field is rolling emergency equipment and clearing all traffic. Be advised, weather at destination is marginal with low ceilings and gusty winds." Of course it was, because catastrophic mechanical failure apparently wasn't challenging enough without adding weather complications to the equation. Reeves tried to bank the aircraft toward the new heading and discovered that what had been difficult was now nearly impossible. The aileron response was so degraded that turning the massive airliner required every ounce of strength both pilots could muster. In the cabin, passengers were beginning to understand that this wasn't routine. The aircraft's movements had become noticeably more erratic, and several people were gripping their armrests with white knuckles. Children began crying, sensing their parents' tension even if they didn't understand the cause. Kestra felt every struggled turn, every fought correction, every moment when the aircraft's nose wanted to drop despite the pilot's best efforts. She could visualize the scene in the cockpit, two professional aviators discovering the limits of human endurance and mechanical capability. She had been in similar situations, though never in an aircraft this large with this many lives at stake. Her training told her to remain seated, to trust the flight crew, to be just another passenger. But her experience whispered that the flight crew was facing something beyond their preparation, something that required a different kind of expertise. She glanced around the cabin and saw fear beginning to replace confusion in passengers' eyes. They were starting to understand that their lives hung in the balance of a struggle being waged in the cockpit ahead. The question that haunted her was whether she could continue to remain anonymous, while 347 people depended on two pilots who might be fighting a battle they couldn't win alone. First Officer Zhang's hands were shaking now, not from fear but from the muscular strain of maintaining pressure on controls that seemed determined to escape her grip. "Captain, I'm reading increasing asymmetric forces across all control surfaces. The aircraft wants to roll left and pitch down no matter what inputs we make." Reeves felt it too, the growing sense that the Boeing 777 was developing its own agenda, one that didn't include continued controlled flight. Each correction required more effort than the last, and he could feel his strength ebbing with every passing minute. His flight training had included scenarios for various system failures, but nothing had prepared him for the physical and mental demands of wrestling with a machine that outweighed a Navy destroyer and was becoming increasingly determined to fall from the sky. "How much fuel do we have remaining?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. Zhang checked her instruments through gritted teeth. "Approximately 90 minutes at current consumption, but that assumes we can maintain this altitude and heading." Both assumptions were becoming increasingly doubtful. The aircraft was descending despite their efforts, and their heading was drifting as they lost the ability to make precise corrections. The mathematics of their situation were simple and terrifying. They were running out of time, fuel, altitude, and control authority simultaneously. Pacific 847, this is Major Collins at Edwards Air Force Base. I'm a test pilot with experience in degraded control authority situations. Can you give me a detailed report on your current control effectiveness? The voice from the military airfield carried a confidence that both airline pilots found reassuring. Here was someone who understood their situation from experience rather than theory. "Major, this is Captain Reeves. We've lost all hydraulic systems and are on manual reversion. Control forces are enormous and increasing. Elevator authority is maybe 20% of normal, ailerons even less. We're fighting constant left roll and nose-down tendencies that are getting stronger." "Copy that, Captain. You're dealing with aerodynamic forces that these aircraft weren't designed to handle manually. I need you to try reducing your airspeed to minimum safe velocity. It'll help with control forces, though you'll sacrifice some altitude." In the passenger cabin, people were no longer pretending this was routine. Flight attendants moved through the aisles checking seat belts and securing loose items with the kind of focused urgency that spoke louder than any announcement. Parents held their children closer, and strangers began making eye contact with the shared understanding that they were all facing the same uncertain fate. Kestra listened to every word of the radio communications bleeding through the cabin speakers, her mind automatically analyzing the tactical situation. She knew Major Collins by reputation, a test pilot with more experience in impossible flying situations than almost anyone alive. If he was concerned enough to personally get on the radio, their situation was even worse than she had calculated. She found herself mentally flying the approach, visualizing the challenges that Captain Reeves and First Officer Zhang would face in the next hour. Landing a hydraulically compromised Boeing 777 wasn't just difficult. It was something that had never been successfully accomplished in aviation history. They were about to attempt the impossible, and everyone aboard would either witness a miracle or become part of a tragedy. The Boeing 777 continued its reluctant journey toward an uncertain destination, carrying 347 souls who were about to discover whether human skill and determination could overcome the fundamental laws of physics and mechanical failure. Captain Reeves attempted to reduce airspeed as Major Collins had suggested, but discovered that even this basic maneuver had become a complex negotiation with an increasingly uncooperative aircraft. Pulling back on the throttles required corresponding adjustments to the elevator to maintain level flight, but those adjustments demanded physical forces that were approaching the limits of human capability. "Speed's coming back, but I'm having to fight harder to maintain altitude," he reported through gritted teeth. "The control forces are exponentially worse at this speed." Major Collins's voice crackled back. "That's expected, Captain. You're in a catch-22 situation. Higher speeds give you better control authority but worse control forces. Lower speeds reverse that equation. You'll need to find the sweet spot for your aircraft's current configuration." Zhang checked their position and fuel state, her hands trembling from the constant muscular tension required to assist with aircraft control. We're still 300 miles from Edwards, and I'm not sure we can maintain this level of physical effort for that duration. The brutal truth was becoming evident to both pilots. They were engaged in a battle of endurance that they might not be able to sustain. Flying a modern airliner without hydraulic assistance wasn't just technically challenging. It was physically exhausting in ways that no simulation could replicate. Their arms burned, their hands were cramping, and they still had hours of flight time remaining before they could attempt the most difficult landing in aviation history. Pacific 847, this is Edwards Tower. We've got every piece of emergency equipment on the field standing by, and we're coordinating with medical facilities throughout the region. What's your current assessment of landing probability? The question hung in the cockpit air like a challenge. Both pilots knew the statistics. No commercial airliner had ever successfully landed after complete hydraulic failure. The few military aircraft that had managed similar emergencies were smaller, lighter, and flown by pilots with extensive training in emergency procedures that commercial aviation simply didn't provide. Edwards Tower, we're going to give it everything we have, Reeves finally answered. But I need you to understand that we're attempting something that hasn't been done before. In the passenger cabin, those words carried through the speakers with devastating clarity. The euphemisms and technical language had been stripped away, replaced by honest assessment of their situation. People began reaching for phones, trying to send messages to loved ones while cellular signals were still available. Others simply stared out windows at the Pacific Ocean, perhaps contemplating the vast emptiness that stretched below their aluminum tube suspended 7 miles above the Earth. Kestra felt the aircraft's continued deterioration through every surface that touched her body. The seat transmitted each struggle against gravity and aerodynamics, each moment when the pilot's strength wasn't quite sufficient to maintain the precise control required for stable flight. She had flown aircraft in similar conditions, but never anything approaching the size and complexity of a Boeing 777. Her experience told her that Captain Reeves and First Officer Zhang were fighting a battle they couldn't win alone. The physical demands were too great, the technical challenges too complex, and the margin for error too small. They needed help, advice, and possibly direct intervention from someone with experience in situations that went beyond normal commercial aviation training. She glanced around the cabin and saw 346 other people whose lives depended on whether two increasingly exhausted pilots could accomplish the impossible. The question that haunted her was whether her desire for anonymity was worth more than their collective survival. The Boeing 777 lurched suddenly to the left, and she felt both pilots struggling to level the wings through the aircraft's mechanical responses. Time was running out, and decisions made in the next few minutes might determine whether Flight 847 became a tragedy or a miracle. The struggle in the cockpit had evolved from technical challenge to physical endurance test. Captain Reeves's uniform shirt was now completely soaked with perspiration, and his arms trembled visibly as he fought to maintain even basic aircraft control. The Boeing 777's control yoke felt like it was connected to concrete blocks instead of flight surfaces, and each input required forces that commercial aviation training had never prepared him for. "I'm losing it," Zhang gasped, her voice tight with strain and exhaustion. "The control forces are beyond what I can maintain." Reeves could see her struggle and knew his own strength was failing at the same rate. They had been battling the aircraft for over an hour, and their muscles were reaching the point of complete failure. Modern airline pilots were trained to manage aircraft systems and make decisions, not to engage in physical combat with machines that outweighed battle tanks. Pacific 847, this is Major Collins again. I need you to try differential thrust steering. Use your engines to help control the aircraft's heading and reduce the load on your flight controls. It was a technique borrowed from military emergency procedures, one that most commercial pilots had heard about but never practiced. Reeves began experimenting with small throttle adjustments, discovering that engine power could indeed influence the aircraft's direction, though with all the precision of steering a freight train with a feather. "It's helping," he reported, "but the control forces are still beyond sustainable levels. I don't think we can maintain this for another 2 hours." The mathematics of their situation had become brutally simple. Their physical endurance was failing faster than their fuel was burning, and both were declining faster than their distance to Edwards Air Force Base. They were engaged in a three-way race between exhaustion, fuel starvation, and reaching a runway, and it wasn't clear which would win. In the passenger cabin, flight attendants had begun preparing for emergency landing procedures, with the kind of grim efficiency that spoke to the severity of their situation. Safety demonstrations were no longer theoretical. They were preparing for an event that might require every passenger to know exactly how to evacuate a potentially damaged aircraft in minimum time. The lead flight attendant's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to review emergency evacuation procedures. This is purely precautionary, but we need everyone's complete attention." Purely precautionary. Even now, the euphemisms continued, but passengers were no longer fooled. Children cried, adults prayed, and everyone aboard began to understand that they were participants in an unfolding drama that would either end in miraculous salvation or tragic loss. Kestra listened to every word of the cockpit communications and felt the aircraft's growing instability through her seat. She could visualize the scene ahead: two exhausted pilots fighting a losing battle against physics and mechanical failure, their strength ebbing with every passing minute. She had been in similar situations, though never with so many lives at stake or in an aircraft this challenging to control manually. Her training and experience whispered that intervention might be necessary, that two commercial pilots, no matter how skilled, might not have the specific expertise required for this particular emergency. But intervention would mean revealing herself, abandoning the anonymity she had fought so hard to achieve, and returning to a world she had sworn to leave behind. The question was whether she could live with herself if she remained silent, while 347 people depended on two pilots, who might be attempting the impossible without the tools or knowledge necessary to succeed. Pacific 847, Edwards Tower. We're tracking your position and descent rate. You need to be aware that at your current trajectory, you'll be below minimum approach altitude before reaching our airspace. The words carried the weight of a death sentence delivered in clinical aviation terminology. Captain Reeves felt the aircraft's nose drop again despite his desperate efforts to maintain level flight, and he realized that Major Collins had been diplomatically avoiding the obvious truth. They weren't going to make it to Edwards Air Force Base with enough altitude or control authority to attempt a landing. "Edwards, what alternatives do we have?" Reeves asked, though he dreaded the answer. The silence stretched for long seconds before Major Collins responded. "Captain, I'm going to be honest with you. At your current rate of control degradation and descent, you have very limited options. There's a possibility of attempting a water landing, but—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in aviation knew the statistics on water landings for large aircraft. They were rarely survivable, especially in open ocean conditions. The Boeing 777 wasn't designed to ditch gracefully. It was built to fly, and without that capability, it became a very expensive way to dig a hole in the Pacific. Zhang checked their instruments with shaking hands. "Fuel remaining is 60 minutes at current consumption, but our descent rate means we'll be at sea level in 40 minutes even if we maintain current heading." The numbers painted a picture of converging catastrophes. They would run out of altitude before they ran out of fuel, and they would reach the ocean while still carrying enough jet fuel to turn any impact into an inferno. The Boeing 777 had become a guided missile aimed at the Pacific, and its two pilots were discovering the limits of human endurance and aviation technology. Pacific 847, this is air traffic control. We're declaring an emergency corridor and clearing all traffic from your projected path. Emergency services are being coordinated for multiple potential scenarios. Multiple potential scenarios. Another euphemism for preparations that included both rescue operations and body recovery, depending on how the next 30 minutes unfolded. In the passenger cabin, people had stopped pretending everything would be fine. Flight attendants moved through the aisles with focused urgency, securing equipment and preparing for scenarios that no one wanted to contemplate. The aircraft's increasingly erratic behavior was impossible to ignore. Each roll, each pitch deviation, each moment when the nose dropped despite the pilot's efforts told the story of a machine dying slowly while carrying 347 souls toward an uncertain fate. Kestra felt every struggle, every moment when the pilot's strength wasn't sufficient to maintain stable flight. She could hear in the radio communications that Captain Reeves and First Officer Zhang were approaching the end of their physical and technical capabilities. They were brave, skilled professionals attempting something beyond the scope of their training, and they were running out of time to accomplish the impossible. The voice in her head that had been whispering for the past hour now spoke with increasing urgency. These people needed help that only she could provide. The question was whether she had the courage to abandon her anonymity and return to a role she had sworn to never fill again. The Boeing 777 continued its reluctant journey toward the Pacific, carrying 347 people whose survival might depend on whether one passenger in row 9 could overcome her own demons in time to help save them all. The moment of truth arrived not with dramatic fanfare, but with the quiet exhaustion in Captain Reeves's voice as he keyed his microphone. "Edwards Tower, I need to be honest with you. We're losing this fight. Control forces are beyond human capability now, and we're descending through 28,000 feet with limited ability to arrest the descent." The words hung in the air like a confession of defeat. First Officer Zhang's arms were visibly shaking as she attempted to assist with aircraft control, her face pale with the combination of physical exhaustion and growing realization that their situation had moved beyond challenging to potentially hopeless. Copy Pacific 847, stand by. The silence that followed felt eternal. In that moment, everyone aboard, from the pilots fighting for control to the passengers gripping their armrests, understood that they had reached the point where conventional solutions were no longer sufficient. The Boeing 777 was teaching them all a harsh lesson about the difference between human capability and mechanical reality. Kestra Voss closed her eyes and felt the aircraft's death spiral through every nerve in her body. The descent rate was increasing. The control responses were becoming more erratic, and somewhere ahead, two commercial pilots were discovering that all their training and experience might not be enough to prevent catastrophe. She had spent 3 years trying to forget the weight of responsibility that came with being the person others turned to when the impossible needed to be accomplished. She had walked away from military aviation because the cost of that responsibility had become unbearable, because the night missions and impossible odds and constant proximity to death had stripped away everything that mattered to her. But now, 37,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, that same responsibility was calling to her again. Not because she wanted it, not because she missed the adrenaline or the glory, but because 347 people were about to discover whether commercial aviation procedures were sufficient for a situation that had moved far beyond the boundaries of normal flight operations. She opened her eyes and looked around the cabin. Parents held their children, strangers offered comfort to strangers, and flight attendants prepared for scenarios that would test every aspect of their training. These people deserved every possible chance for survival, and that chance might require expertise that existed in very few places in the world. Kestra unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. The movement felt like crossing a line she had sworn never to cross again, abandoning an anonymity she had fought hard to achieve. But the Boeing 777's increasingly desperate mechanical voices were speaking to her in a language that transcended personal vows and individual desires. This aircraft needed someone who understood its distress signals, someone who could translate its mechanical symptoms into human solutions. She walked toward the front of the cabin, past passengers who were too focused on